Hello, my name is David Nolan, and I'm the host of Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. Today, I'm talking with Anthony Lucero, the immediate past president of the Organization for Latino Actuaries. Anthony, welcome to Actuary Voices.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. So, I like to get a sense of where people are coming from at the beginning of our podcast, how you came to be an actuary.
I grew up in Southern California, and I was looking, back when I was in high school, looking at different career options, trying to figure out, what do I want to do with my career? How can I make a bigger impact, on the world through that? And of course, being 16, 17, you don't really know too much about the world looking back on it. So, I looked into being a doctor. That was one option, looked into, going into business, into finance. But none of those options really seemed to appeal to, kind of what I wanted to do at the intersection of business and a little bit, heavier math focus. So as I was looking through options, I did one of those career assessments that the high school offers, and they came up with the option actuary. And I said, I don't know what that is. So I started researching online, and through that process, I came across a scholarship program that, took you to a 1 week of, networking and different class opportunities at Illinois State University. And it was through that program that I, got all expenses paid to fly out to the campus for 1 week. And they gave us a room and board for the week. And we met with a bunch of different actuaries from different consulting firms, insurance carriers, and professors at the university as well, talked about, here's what the actuarial exams look like. They gave us a sample exam to kind of, see here's what you would get tested on. And I guess through all of that, I was pretty convinced, this is what I want to do. I think just hearing about the different career options, hearing about, the different skill sets you need as an actuary, that really appealed to me. And so I moved to New York City to, go study actuarial science at St. John's University in Queens. I, spent the 4 years there, had a great, education there. And then I took my first full-time role at Mercer as an actuarial analyst in their retirement consulting business. And since then, moved around into the pension risk transfer business for a little bit, in the mortality experience studies, and then now I'm back in the retirement consulting business at WTW.
It's somewhat unusual to find out about the actuarial career in high school. You often hear about students finding out about it in college or even completely by accident. So that was pretty, well, progressive, for want of a better word, from your school.
Yeah, definitely. And I think too, what's interesting about that is that experience, I think, really shaped my career, because had I found out about it later on, I don't think I would have passed, my exams as early as I did. I wouldn't have been in a program that set you up for that success so early on. And I think having that experience plus all the different career development opportunities that I did back when I was in college, all of that really shaped, kind of the, inspiration and the skill set that I needed to do what I do now with Ola. So, I look back at all of that, I said, all of it kind of fell into place to kind of take us where we are today.
You stayed in your career for a while. What do you find personally fulfilling about it?
I think the best part of it is you can have an impact no matter how great or small it is. When I mentioned earlier that I was, in high school trying to figure out which career would give me that ability to have an impact on society, I think as a high schooler, you think of, oh, I want to, change the world, and I want to do this and that. And, by the time I'm 30 and that sort of thing. And I think, what I've learned over the past couple of years of being in this career, coming up on nearly a decade now of being an actuary, is that the biggest impacts that you can have are sometimes from the smallest actions you take, right? So for me, being in the retirement consulting business, people often hear retirement, they think, oh, that's a dying field. It's a dying practice, because, pension plans, as they're known, or as they've been known historically, are, going away in that form, right? Well, what that means is there's been a large gap left in the way that people can retire comfortably, the way that employers are trying to resolve that issue. And, when you think about that, that's a major societal issue, but it's something that we as retirement consultants have a lot of ability to impact, even just through having, one-off calls with our clients, or, having a session with a client about different solutions to different issues they're having, what type of lifetime income are their employees looking for. And so there's a lot of that I don't think you really get a sense of how important that stuff is until later on, when you have that experience and you have that ability to see into, how those small conversations can turn into very large impacts.
And do you mainly work with larger companies rather than individuals?
Yeah, it's definitely very much, being in a company like WTW, most of our clients are pretty large. I will say, just because they're large doesn't always mean that their plans are very large. Some of the plans may be, smaller because, a lot of them, the participant base is, decreasing over time, or they might open smaller plans for select, segments of their, employees. So I think what's really great about it is you can, work with really large plans that have a lot of complexity and a lot of different things you have to resolve, but you can also work with a lot of smaller plans that you get to know more intimately because of the size.
And have you had any challenges in your career, or has it been plain sailing all the way through?
Now, I mean, overall, it's been a really great career so far, and I think I've had a lot of support in making, what I have so far out of those, nearly a decade of, working as an actuary. I will say the challenges that I've had are, and they're challenges I think a lot of people face, especially early on in their career. When you're in a career that's so technical and at least starts out so technical, right? Like that of the actuarial profession. There's a lot of that imposter syndrome, I think. You take the exams, learn the materials through your trainings at work, but then when you finally get to actually do the work, especially in those first 2 to 3 years, you ask yourself, am I smart enough to do this? Which is a crazy thought given, all the actuaries in the profession are passing these really complicated exams, but you nonetheless encounter that and ask yourself, am I the right person to do this? Am I going to grow in this career? And I think that was something I definitely struggled with early on, and I think not having networked with a lot of more experienced actuaries in my company until a little bit later on. I think that made it difficult to navigate until I was able to identify those role models that kind of, reassured me, hey, everyone goes through this. This is something that you'll experience, and, you do get better at identifying what to worry about, what not to worry about as much, and, being able to use your technical skill set alongside the business acumen that really helps later on.
You're the immediate past president of the Organization of Latino Actuaries. I wonder, could you tell us a little bit about the organization, its history, and its progress through the years?
Definitely. Yeah. OLA is the Organization of Latino Actuaries, as you said. And OLA was founded back in 2017 by six co-founders from both the Society of Actuaries side and the casualty actuarial side. So, having both kind of sides of the industry there. And the co-founders had the original mission of just increasing the Latina representation in the profession. And one of the reasons they identified that as a primary goal early on was because at the time, the Latina population in the US was nearing something about, 15 to 20% at that point, but the representation of Latina actuaries in the profession was only about 1 to 2% of actuaries. So there was a major disparity in what percentage of actuaries identify as Latina versus what percentage of the entire population identified as Latina. And you could say, oh, it's STEM and careers, and it's this and that, societal factors that contribute to that. But it was interesting because even within STEM careers, I think about 10% of professionals in STEM careers were identifying as Latinas. So it was something that was really, even peeling apart all those layers was very much an actuarial issue. So when they founded the organization, the main goal was to just increase that representation, and they took it upon themselves to find all the right resources to connect any college university students that were studying actuarial science or maybe finding out about the profession, any career changers, anyone who maybe had found out about the profession in their senior year and needed to kind of pivot really quickly before graduating or shortly after graduating. And really, a lot of the work that was in those early years was to establish an early career development framework to help them, find their first roles and help them succeed in their first roles. So, moving into about the time that I joined the board back in 2022, we, started pivoting into, how do we make this more scalable. The organization was growing very quickly, and the number of people that we were helping was also growing very quickly. And so it became, clear that we couldn't do all of this, just alone, right? As a small board of, 8 to 9 people, right? So as time went on, we started adding program managers, we started pulling in more volunteers. And I think, a lot of that framework was already in place from what the co-founders had done, but I think it really just took having those additional volunteers, having that additional capacity to start making all of this, much more scalable, much more, operational and easy to pick up for anyone new coming into the organization. Because I think when you have such a young organization, it's, very easy for things to just, live in someone's head, right? and not be able to take it further and into something that someone can replicate through a process or, some sort of idea, some sort of inspiration that, really helps people carry the mission forward, right? So, fast forward, 2022, we were just beginning to start doing in-person events again, as the pandemic, or at least the major issues with the pandemic started to subside. Looking, ahead, we said, okay, we want to start bringing people together again. And at first we would, kind of latch onto other conferences and take students to help get them exposed to in-person networking opportunities. But then, we decided let's, start, maybe our Rising Leaders program, students, have them network with our platinum sponsors. And then that turned into, let's bring all of our, students or prospects, as we call them, because, some of them are career changers and recent graduates. How do we get them to network with, a wider range of our sponsors? And finally, this past year, as we updated our mission, vision, and strategic pillars, we decided let's not just open this to students, let's open this to the full actuarial community. So, both, prospects and professionals can engage in these development opportunities and, set themselves up not just for success in their first roles, but success in their future, leadership potential and everything, following from that.
Yes, I was at your meeting this year in San Diego, and I was hugely impressed at the level of the content that was being provided. The sessions were very engaging and fascinating. So, congratulations on that.
Thanks.
And that was your first standalone one, right?
Yes. So we technically had our first, standalone event last year in Las Vegas, but it was a much smaller scale sort of thing. It was mainly a recruiting sort of event. So a lot of the activity that was there was, development sessions for prospects, the in-person career fair, for prospects. So this year's was really the first full-fledged conference where, we offered everything from, recruiting to development to networking, leadership development. It really ran the full gamut of, what can OLA do for its community, right? And I think we were just so excited to see how everything turned out. And when you put a lot of work into it, for something that is fully volunteer run, basically, it's something just, we were so proud to see how everything turned out and what the team was able to achieve and the impact that it was able to have. I think, we talked about as an organization, how are we going to ensure that this is something sustainable we continue to do? How are we going to make sure we still have the funding to do this, the volunteer capacity to do this? And I think the, common thread throughout all of those conversations was, regardless of how we do it, we need to do it because it really just meant that much to the community and to the industry that we took on this endeavor that we did.
As a participant, it ran incredibly smoothly, and it is mind blowing that you did it all on a voluntary basis. Because I go to other conferences that are very definitely staff driven, and having participated in some of those, I know it's an enormous amount of work. So, congratulations again, and I look
Thanks.
forward to attending next year's one. Let me take a moment to remind listeners that you're listening to Actuary Voices, the podcast of the American Academy of Actuaries. On this podcast, we talk to Academy volunteers and leaders, as well as friends of the Academy, about what inspires them about their work, both professionally or as a friend or a volunteer with the Academy. Please subscribe to Actuary Voices on your preferred podcast platform. And now, back to my conversation with Anthony Lucero, the immediate past president of the Organization for Latino Actuaries. So, having come this far, you are a young organization, but you are, I imagine, the second oldest of the affinity groups after the International Association of Black Actuaries, but still less than 10 years old. What are your plans for the future?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think, that comes along with not just, I think, the really rapid growth we've seen in the last, 4 to 5 years, since we started going more in person with a lot of our programming. I think where we wanted to go at the beginning of this year, was trying to really gear more of our programming toward our professional cohort of members. And I think a lot of that was because, as I was mentioning earlier, right, the early years of OLA were focused on getting a lot more representation in the, early career ranks of a lot of different companies. So getting more, interns, more analysts that, identify as Latina and increasing that representation there. As we see a lot of those students, a lot of those candidates that we helped early on move forward in their careers, they're now hitting some of them are even hitting the 5 to 7 year mark in their careers. That's a pivot point for them to start looking at how can they reach their first managerial role, how can they, go into leadership or specialize in something as an individual contributor. And we realized as a board that that's a segment that we haven't really focus too much energy on and too much of our resources on. So that was part of the inspiration to expand the Avanza conference this year to, have professional programming, because we saw that there was that gap in being able to help that segment in our demographic. Where I see the future of these efforts is, now that we've, you know, gone into doing more of that and redefining our strategic pillars to, foster more scalable relationships, develop future leaders, increase that representation. We are also facing a lot of challenges, just with the current socioeconomic and political environment that, isn't the most supportive of, diversity and equity and inclusion efforts, right? And so I think it's something that we're trying to navigate and figure out how can we still offer the resources that we do and how can we still reach the people that we do, without excluding anyone, without, falling into any, practices or really any type of programming that, could be deemed unlawful, under new administration rules. And, there's a lot of that legal framework we have to navigate. There's a lot of just, social constructs we have to really contend with and just say, what are we doing? What does this mean to the industry, to the community? And how do we continue that great work? And for a lot of it, it is still very uncertain that, things change every day as we see, and that's, I think, just the nature of the world in general. Every day is a different challenge. And I have to say, I'm really proud of our leadership team for, really rolling with that and just saying we're going to figure it out. We're going to see how we can continue to make the best impact, not just for the Latina community, but just for the actual profession as a whole. And I think it's something that we're really excited about, saying, despite what gets thrown our way, we're going to be able to make it through.
And have you seen any direct impact on Ola as a result of recent political changes?
That's a great question. I think to, your point earlier, right? Some of the impacts are more confidential and more sensitive in nature. But one thing that I think is, pretty broad, not just with Ola, but affinity groups altogether, some of the nonprofit partners we work with that, work with the Latina community in business or, in STEM or, something non-actuarial, right? I think every organization is facing, not just the changing political environment in which, you have to kind of navigate a different operational structure and how you're offering the opportunities that you do without, creating any exclusionary practices or anything like that. But then there's also issues of funding, right? And part of it comes from, certain employers that are corporate sponsors, they have to rethink, okay, if we're sponsoring this organization, what exactly are we sponsoring? What is, what comes with that funding? What is restricted funding? What is not? And how is it being used, right? If they're participating in hiring events, then there's a question of, okay, are we engaging in fair hiring practices by going to this event that may appear to be just for a certain demographic, but may technically be open to everyone, right? And I think that's, something that we've tried to clarify as an organization is that, Ola, even though the mission has been to help increase the representation of Latino actuaries, the organization welcomes anyone from every background and, offers resources to everyone. And I think, we're really proud to say that not just the people that receive scholarships and exam support, but also even our leadership team reflects that, we incorporate a lot of the allyship in our practices, right? But we do see that, some companies still, because they, their legal teams might take a different approach and how they're, reading into what OLA does or what IABA does or any other organization, right? They may be hesitant to fund the organization, until they can get better clarity on what they can and can't do as a company. And that does, have a direct, impact on our funding, right? And we've seen, a handful of companies that have had to, pull out funding because of that. But generally, it hasn't been a widespread issue because we've been able to work with them and figure out how to say, okay, what is it that OLA does? What is it that OLA doesn't do? What do you support with your funding and what do you not support? And I think having those honest conversations with our sponsors has been really helpful in navigating that.
And if people or organizations want to help out Ola, what's the best way of doing that?
I think the best way people can help is raise awareness, and that could mean a variety of different things. It could be raising awareness of the profession, so if you work with high schoolers, for example, if you work with, college counselors, for example, or advisors that work with students, kind of raising awareness about the profession with them, letting them know, hey, this is what an actuary is, this is what they do. Here's an organization called OLA that is helping, students get into the profession. Having that awareness out there really helps just open the door and get people to apply for opportunities. Going to the Ola Avanza conference, through OLA travel sponsorship is a great opportunity for any college student or recent graduate or career changer to get exposure to what an in-person conference looks like, what those in-person networking opportunities look like and how to engage with professionals. And that's something that, we offer, but sometimes, if people don't apply for it, right, then the opportunity can't really be that useful, right? So it's one thing to get the funding that we do and the volunteers that we do to make these things happen. But, on the flip side of that, we also need to get enough students, enough people aware of these opportunities so they can take advantage of them. So I'd say that's the first thing people can do to help. And I think the second thing is, kind of now looking on the, internal, operations side, right? If you have capacity to help, we're always looking for volunteers to mentor our students, especially, those are a little bit longer term commitments. If you're looking for something short term, being able to offer a resume review, a mock interview, those things can really go a long way in getting someone prepared for their first interview or their first job application. And then now that we're, moving into a more, scalable operational stage of OLA's, evolution, we're also looking for volunteers that are good with just, building processes, managing data, trying to help with the finances of the organization, things that we're hopefully, going to be able to get a full-time staff member to do at some point in the future. But until then, we can definitely use all the help we can get there.
And people can find out more on your website, which is latinoactuaries.org.
Correct. Yeah, we have a latinoactuaries.org/volunteer. That is our website to, just encompasses all the different volunteer opportunities. Everything that you would want to do with OLA, we definitely have it there available. So if you do have any questions, just, reach out to info@latinoactuaries.org and we'll definitely direct you to the right place.
Great. And people can join your organization pretty easily and be kept up to date as well, right?
Yeah, so we have a member portal, members.latinoactuaries.org. People can create an online account. And not only does it give them access to kind of network with other people within the organization, it also gives them access to, emails, newsletters, anything that might come through. And the great thing about that portal is that that was one operational change we made back in 2022. Before we were relying on Excel spreadsheets, and if you change jobs, right, it's like then you have to go to, a billion different avenues to try to find the most updated information. But now with the OLA member portal, you can go in, update your information, update your email, update, which metro area you live in. So if you want emails about events happening in the Dallas Fort Worth area, for example, now you can, change that at any time. So there's a lot of ways to customize the experience that you have with OLA.
Well, the Academy is a proud supporter of OLA, and we look forward to continuing that support. And we're happy to work with you. If you want to host an event in Washington, D.C., we're more than happy to help put that on.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're always looking for opportunities to partner more. And, whether it's the, more nonprofit side of the industry or the corporate sponsor side, we really do appreciate all the partnerships that we have and our affinity groups as well. I think, every partnership that we have serves a different role in what we're able to do and how we're able to engage with the industry, with, prospects and, everything else right across the spectrum of who we serve. So I really appreciate the support from the Academy and the ability to share, kind of our great work here as well and be able to do that.
And I hope we'll be able to participate in next year's annual meeting. I'll put a plug in there live on the podcast.
Awesome.
I'd like to take a little bit wider now and think about the profession writ large and what you see the prospects for the profession, whether you want to talk about the retirement area, which is yours, or more generally.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's interesting because, when I go to conferences, right, whether it's a conference focused on, aspiring actuaries, at the college university stage or even the high school stage sometimes if they're doing like an actuarial day for high school students, or it's like, the SOA Impact Conference, the CIS annual meeting, those events that cater more to more experienced professionals. The question is always the same, right? Where is the actual profession going? And one of the key themes you always hear about is the role of artificial intelligence in the profession. And, that will have a large part in our profession. It will play a large role in, how we evolve our skill set as actuaries. What skills are we going to need to use more of in the future? What skills will not be needed as much moving forward? But one thing I can say, just having worked with the quality of the young talent that I have in our profession and working with such, great mentors and, experienced actuaries and industry leaders, honestly, just throughout the work that I've done in OLA, I've quickly realized that the common thread of the skill set that makes us the most valuable to our clients, or if you're on the insurance side, right, to your stakeholders and your consumer base, the best skill set that we can offer is just our business acumen, right? And it's how do we see the world? How do we identify what our stakeholders need? How do we serve those gaps where maybe something is underinsured, or on the retirement side, right, where people are experiencing financial insecurity? We can get algorithms to do our modeling, to do our pricing. We can get analysts at different levels to do different coding and to build different spreadsheets, models, in whatever language it is. But at the end of the day, what really I think separates us from a lot of other professions is the trust that people have in the work that we do, the level of credibility that we have through our credentialing process, through the amount of continuing education that we have to continue receiving. And I think just the trust that the regulatory bodies have in us to do what we do best, right? And that's where I think, when I talk to, the newest talent coming into the industry, I very confidently tell them, yeah, AI will change things, the climate change, the global, political situation, all of that stuff will change things for us as a profession moving forward. But one thing that will remain the same is just that ability to solve business problems with the really heavy math background.
AI definitely is an opportunity to free us up from doing some of the, you might want to say, more mundane tasks,
Mhm.
give us room to be more imaginative and creative. And that's true for the actuarial profession as it is for many, many others.
Yeah, definitely.
So, Anthony, well, thank you very much for joining us today. Is there anything you'd like to say as a final parting word?
Yeah, definitely. I think the most important thing that we found in doing our work as Ola is, yeah, we have great leadership, in our ranks. We have amazing members, amazing volunteers. I think what really helps us keep that momentum going and just keep doing the great work that we do, despite the challenges that we face every day, is the support of the industry, the Society of Actuaries, Casualty Actuarial Society, the American Academy of Actuaries, all of our corporate sponsors in different areas of the industry, and just the allyship that we have from just the different affinity groups, even people that we work with at our own companies, during our day jobs, as we call them. All of that contributes to a better understanding of what we do, a better understanding of how to be more inclusive in the profession, how to better adapt to your colleagues and help them adapt to your company culture as well, and really establishing those connections and building those bridges. We can get as many actual students into the entry level jobs at different companies as we want, but at the end of the day, they won't succeed unless we have that partnership from the industry to do that. So we're really grateful for the support that we've had just across the industry, and we hope that continues, and we're really looking forward to just seeing where things go over the next couple of years.
Great. Well, we are looking forward to watching you grow and helping support you in any way we can. Anthony, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. Really appreciate it.
You've been listening to my conversation with Anthony Lucero, the immediate past president of the Organization for Latino Actuaries. My name is David Nolan, and I'm the host of Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. Please visit our website, actuary.org, for a wealth of information about the work that the Academy does. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn as well. And of course, please subscribe to this podcast on your preferred podcast platform.